Welcome back to the conversation. I am your host, Nando Vila. I'm very excited to speak to our next guest, Brendan O'Connor. Brendan is a freelance journalist based in New York City, and he's the author of a new book, which is tearing up the charts, Blood Red Lines, How Nativism Fuels the Right. Unfortunately, or rather fortunately, as you say, a very timely book. Brendan, how are you?
I'm all right. Thanks for having me on, Nando.
So your book is about how nativism fuels the right. So I guess my first question is, so how does nativism fuel the
right? Yeah, that's a great question. I chose nativism as the framework to try to understand what is happening on the far right during the Trump administration, but really in the years and decades running up to the Trump administration, because I thought that it would be a useful lens and framework to understand the way that race and labor and capital and nationhood all intersect and kind of build off of one another. And it seems to me that nativist impulses and currents are really central to what is driving the far right now. And I think will continue to be central in the years to come as the ongoing crises of capitalism, of democracy, of the climate, of the economy, all continue to collide and escalate. And I think that nativism is going to continue to be a really animating political dynamic.
Yeah, it strikes me as obviously we have Trump in the United States, but we've also seen almost in a more clear way because of the multi-party systems in Europe, how specifically the issue of immigration is just great fodder for the far right. I mean, many of these kind of far right parties in Europe are explicitly anti-immigrant, even in a way that the Republican Party doesn't even quite go to, at least sort of rhetorically and openly. Why is it such a powerful issue for the far right? What tool does it serve in the current system?
Yeah, so I think as you observe, in European parties and in other parts of the world, right-wing parties or the coalitions that exist within the Republican Party in the United States are kind of broken out. And so the constitutive parts are made much more explicit. I think in the US, what we've seen over the course of really the past century and a half, but in a way that it has accelerated in the past half a century or so, is that while capital and the ruling class continue to cultivate and encourage anti-immigrant sentiment, and they do this as a way, simply put, to create the political conditions for a hyper exploitable, hyper oppressed layer of the ruling class. And I'm talking about migrant labor generally and undocumented labor specifically. These impulses and this political tendency in recent years in the US and elsewhere has kind of taken on its own momentum and has kind of escaped in certain ways kind of the orbit of capital dominated politics. That's maybe overstating a little bit, but this conflict and this this kind of clash of interests is what my book is exploring.
Yeah, I mean, because it strikes me as if you go to your average plutocrat, your average Jeff Bezos, and you ask him about immigrants, he probably answers like, no, they're great, I love them, all that stuff. But on the other hand, as the neoliberal era kind of took root in the 80s and 90s, we started to see a turn towards much more restrictive immigration policies in the United States, starting with the Clinton administration, through the Bush administration, through the Obama administration, and of course through the Trump administration. That even as capital becomes more dominant in our politics, and you would think that they would like, oh hey, I'll come in, yeah, free cheap labor. The restrictions on immigration have become much harder at the same time. So It just seems like an interesting tension, as you say.
Yeah, it's definitely complicated. I mean, I think the other thing that we have to keep in mind is that in that same era, it's become much easier for capital to move around the world and to take advantage of and exploit cheap labor outside of the US. And in order to keep cheap labor in one place, it has to keep that it has to fix it in place. That's where borders and militarized borders and heavily enforced borders become important to the kind of global capitalist regime. That being said, there are industries domestically in the US that still rely on migrant labor and undocumented migrant labor in agriculture, in construction and development, in the service industries. And so there are parts of the capitalist class that are resistant, are resistant to a kind of total exclusion of migrant labor, but still benefit from the repression of migrant labor.
What do you say to people who make the point that, well, if you have all this immigration, you have this increased supply of workers, you'll have downward pressure on wages because you have all this influx of people, right? You have if you open the floodgates, they'll just come in because their countries suck, and they're gonna come to our country, and there's gonna be a downward pressure on wages. Like what is the kind of like appropriate left response to something like that?
So I think there's a couple of ways to respond to that. One being that, well, the answer to the hyper exploitation of labor is not to align with the nativists, but to say that, well, yeah, we need a stronger labor rights regime in this country. We need to empower workers to organize and fight for their own interests and support them when they do so, whether they are citizens or non-citizens. But the other aspect of this is that the forces that are displacing people, that are putting people in a position where they have to choose to leave their homes, are the forces of imperialism, the forces of neocolonialism, the forces of climate change, which is the consequence of capitalist activity. And so we have on the left, there's a strategic, it's a strategic alignment of interests that a migrant justice framework reveals, I think. But there is also a need to see that we are all victims of different parts of the same system, and so there's no good in denying. There's no point in kind of obscuring that.
It's your book was obviously very timely. And in my darkest moments, I think about what you just said about the climate crisis and how it drives migration, and that as the climate crisis gets worse, we're just going to see much bigger migrations of people, or at least, and that's only going to fuel more of this nativist right that you talk about, not just here but all over the developed world. How are you processing the current moment? Are you feeling bleak, or are you feeling optimistic? I mean, your book's doing well, so that feels good. But beyond that,
well, yeah, I don't know. I don't know how well. I mean, I know my friends like it. I don't know how well it's doing.
Well, you're on TYT, man. This is the biggest.
Yes. Thank you for having me. I'm very grateful.
Network in the
world. How am I feeling? I think that you're right. I think that there is a very dark future on the horizon. I think that the storming of the US Capitol and congressional buildings is not the end of something, but is a sign of things to come. But I also think that we are just as we are in a period of a kind of what I identify as a nascent fascist movement. We're also in a period of left-wing, an upsurge of left-wing organizing and a kind of clarity of purpose in movements for liberation of workers and the poor and oppressed people, not just in the US, but around the world. And so I think that there are a lot of possibilities on the horizon, some very dark, yes, but many much brighter than that. And so I think that the future is open and that it's up to us to, make the future that we want.
Sounds like the center cannot hold. It's either going to be fascists or us on the left. Brendan O'Connor, thank you so much for joining us. This was great. Everyone go out and check out Brendan's book, Blood Red Lines: How Nativism Fuels the Right.
Thanks, Nando.
Thank you. All right, everyone, take it easy until the next time on The Conversation.
Thanks for watching The Young Turks. Really appreciate it. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. You'll get to interact with us more. There's live chat emojis, badges. You've got emojis of me, Anna, John, JR. So those are super fun. But you also get playback of our exclusive member-only shows and specials right after they air. So all of that, all you gotta do is click that join button right underneath the video. Thank you.